Welcome back to Beatrice's Quiet Tales, where the things people dismiss as ordinary often turn out to be the most valuable treasures they ever touched. I'm Beatrice. Tonight's story comes from a woman named Margaret Bennett who wrote to me after watching her husband's entire workshop disappear piece by piece because everyone thought they already knew what it was worth. They didn't. Stay with me until the middle of this story, because I'll share the one moment that completely changed how I think about inheritance, family, and the dangerous habit of judging value before we understand it. Now, let me tell you Margaret's story in her own words. The first person to raise the auction paddle was my own son, not because he wanted one of his father's tools, because he wanted strangers to buy them. I watched him smile politely while people wandered through the workshop where my husband had spent 43 years building a life with his hands. One man tested the balance of Thomas's favorite hand plane. Another laughed that nobody used old-fashioned tools anymore. Someone offered $15 for the workbench he'd built before Michael was born. Nobody knew what I knew. And for nearly 10 minutes, I honestly believed I was about to lose it forever. My name is Margaret Bennett. I'm 68 years old, and until last autumn, I spent 45 years married to the quietest man in Maple Ridge, Vermont. Thomas Bennett wasn't famous. He wasn't wealthy. He never cared about titles or promotions. He built furniture. He repaired church pews. He restored rocking chairs that families thought were beyond saving. If something was broken, Thomas believed it deserved one honest attempt before anyone gave up on it. These names feel authentic for an American audience in their late 60s and 70s and fit the tone of family drama without sounding overly common or artificial. Thomas believed anything worth building was also worth repairing. People used to joke that if the world ever ended, my husband would probably be standing in the middle of it, quietly fixing somebody's broken porch swing. He would smile, wipe the sawdust from his hands, and ask whether they wanted the old finish preserved or replaced. That was simply who he was. For 43 years, our workshop sat on the edge of Maple Ridge beside County Road 12. It wasn't much to look at, white paint peeling from the siding, a faded sign that hadn't been replaced in 20 years, the smell of cedar and walnut drifting through the open doors every summer. People came from neighboring towns because Thomas never rushed. He'd spend 10 hours restoring a chair worth $50 simply because it had belonged to someone's grandmother. Objects remember people, he'd always say. If we throw away everything that's old, eventually we'll forget who we are. Back then, I thought he was talking about furniture. Now I know he was talking about families. Thomas passed away 8 months before the auction. Pancreatic cancer. One ordinary Tuesday became doctor's appointments. Appointments became treatments. Treatments became hope. Hope slowly became counting good days instead of long-term plans. The workshop stayed open almost until the end. Even after chemotherapy, he'd insist on sitting at his bench for an hour every morning. Sometimes he wasn't even working. He simply wanted to hear the familiar sounds, a plane gliding across oak, a chisel tapping gently against maple, birds singing through the open window. "I don't want my last memories to smell like hospitals," he told me one afternoon. "I'd rather smell sawdust." After the funeral, everyone was kind. Neighbors brought casseroles. Church friends stopped by almost every evening. People promised to help with anything I needed. Then, slowly, life resumed. The visits became weekly, then monthly. Eventually, it was just me and the workshop. I couldn't bring myself to change anything. His glasses still rested on the workbench. His old radios still sat on the windowsill. His measuring tape remained clipped exactly where he'd left it. Every morning I opened the shop doors, not because customers still came. They didn't. I opened them because the silence felt smaller when sunlight came inside. Then Michael started visiting more often. Our son had always been practical. He loved his father. There was never any doubt about that. But unlike Thomas, Michael measured life in efficiency. If something no longer served a purpose, it should probably be replaced. He worked as a regional sales manager in Boston. Deadlines, meetings, quarterly reports. His world moved much faster than ours ever had. At first, he simply worried about me living alone. Then he started worrying about the property, the insurance, the taxes, the empty workshop. One Saturday morning, he stood beside the old lumber rack with his hands in his pockets. "Mom," he said carefully, "Dad wouldn't want you carrying all of this by yourself." I nodded. "I know. You don't use these machines." "No, they're just sitting here." "Yes." He looked around before speaking again. "We should probably sell everything." The words landed harder than I expected, not because he meant to hurt me, because he genuinely believed he was helping. That somehow made it worse. I ran my fingers across Thomas's workbench. Every dent had a story. Every stain had happened on a day we had shared. Selling the tools felt less like clearing a building and more like erasing a language only the two of us still understood. But I didn't argue, not yet. Because there was one thing Michael didn't know, one promise I'd made to Thomas during his final week, a promise I hadn't told another living soul. And before anyone carried a single tool out of that workshop, I needed to decide whether keeping that promise would save my family or destroy it forever. Thomas asked for my promise 3 days before he died. It wasn't dramatic. There were no machines beeping, no last-minute confessions, just a quiet afternoon with rain tapping softly against the hospital window. He looked thinner than I'd ever seen him, but his eyes were exactly the same. Steady, patient, certain. "Margaret," he said, "I need you to promise me something." I squeezed his hand. "You already know I will." He smiled. "I know." Then he surprised me. "When I'm gone, don't let anyone empty the workshop until you've opened my red toolbox." For a second, I thought I'd misunderstood. "The little one?" I asked. "The old metal one?" He nodded. "The one with the chipped handle." I frowned. "I've opened that toolbox 100 times. "Not all the way." I laughed softly. "I think I'd know my own husband's toolbox." "You know the tools." He smiled again. "You don't know the toolbox." Those were such strange words that I never forgot them. "What do you mean? You'll understand." I waited for him to explain. Instead, he closed his eyes for a moment, gathering enough strength to continue. "Promise me something else. I'm listening." "Whatever happens," he paused for a breath, "don't tell anyone until you're absolutely sure they're looking with their heart instead of their wallet." I remember staring at him. "What is inside that toolbox?" His answer was almost a whisper. "Not money." That confused me even more. "If it isn't money," he squeezed my hand, "it becomes money later." Then he smiled with that quiet confidence he'd carried through our entire marriage. "I've had 30 years to think this through." I wanted more answers. Instead, the nurse walked in to check his medication. By the time we were alone again, Thomas had fallen asleep. We never spoke about the toolbox again. It became our last unfinished conversation. The morning after the funeral, I walked into the workshop before sunrise. Everything smelled exactly the way it always had. Pine, machine oil, fresh shavings. His coffee mug still sat beside the drill press. There was half a pencil tucked behind the old calendar. A tape measure lay stretched across the bench where he'd left it. For almost 20 minutes, I simply stood there. Finally, I walked over to the red toolbox. It wasn't impressive. Most people would have passed it without a second glance. The paint had faded years ago. One corner was dented. The black handle had a crack running through the middle. Inside were exactly what I'd expected: screwdrivers, pliers, Allen keys, old socket sets, a few carefully folded shop rags. Nothing unusual. I almost laughed. Had illness confused him during those last days? Then I remembered his words. Not all the way. I lifted every tray, removed every wrench, every bolt, every screwdriver. Still nothing. I sat back on the stool. Maybe this was grief playing tricks on me. Maybe there never had been a secret. Then, while wiping dust from the bottom, my thumb caught something strange. A tiny groove, no wider than my fingernail. I'd never noticed it before. I pressed it. Nothing happened. I pressed harder. A soft metallic click echoed through the empty workshop. I froze. The bottom of the toolbox shifted barely an inch. There was another compartment, hidden beneath nearly 40 years of ordinary tools. My heart started beating so loudly I could hear it. Inside wasn't cash. It wasn't jewelry. It wasn't gold. It was a thick, waterproof envelope. My name was written across the front, not in fancy handwriting, just Thomas's familiar block letters. F.O.R. Margaret. Open only after I'm gone. My hands trembled so badly I could barely unfold the flap. Inside was a stack of documents, a handwritten letter, several photographs, and one small brass key taped to the back of the envelope. I looked at the first page and had to read the opening sentence 3 times before I believed what I was seeing. Because in that single sentence, I realized my husband had been quietly planning something for almost 3 decades. Something no one in our family had ever suspected. And suddenly, the workshop wasn't just a building full of old tools anymore. It had become the center of a promise that was about to test every person who claimed to love him. I didn't open the letter first. I know that sounds strange. Most people would have, but after 45 years of marriage, I had learned something about Thomas. He arranged things in the order he wanted them discovered. So I started with the documents. The first page was a property survey. The second was a tax record. The third was a notarized deed. I stared at the address. I didn't recognize it, not immediately. Then I noticed the county. It was only 20 miles north of Maple Ridge. I knew the area. 30 years earlier, it had been little more than abandoned farmland. Nobody wanted it. People joked you couldn't even grow weeds there. I flipped another page. Purchase date, another deed, another, then another, and another. Every few years, Thomas had quietly purchased another small parcel. 2 acres, 3 acres, 1 acre, 5 acres, never anything expensive, never enough for anyone to notice. By the final page, those scattered pieces formed nearly 30 acres of connected land. I felt my throat tighten. When had he done this? How had I never known? Then I opened the letter. My Margaret, if you're reading this, then I've already lost my argument with time. Don't waste too many tears on an old carpenter. I've had a wonderful life. I smiled, despite myself. That sounded exactly like him. You'll probably wonder why I never mention the land. It's because people behave differently when they know something is valuable. I wanted to know who loved the workshop and who only loved what it might be worth. I stopped reading. His words settled heavily in the silent room. He already knew. Somehow, he had expected this. I continued. Every overtime job, every church restoration, every kitchen cabinet I built after dinner, every Saturday I told you I had one more customer. That money bought another piece of land. Not because I wanted to be rich, because I wanted our grandchildren to start life with choices I never had. My eyes filled with tears. We had talked countless times about his extra work. I thought he simply enjoyed staying busy. I never imagined every additional paycheck had quietly become another acre. Then came the sentence that made me put the letter down. Do not sell anything from the workshop until you've watched how everyone behaves. People always reveal themselves when they think they're dividing an inheritance. I whispered into the empty room. You knew! It wasn't a question. It was amazement. Thomas had seen something coming years before it happened. The brass key belonged to a small safe. I recognized it immediately. It was hidden behind the old lumber shelves. I'd dusted around that safe for years. I'd never opened it. Inside were appraisal reports, updated every few years, letters from developers, maps showing future highway expansion. The newest appraisal had been completed only 6 months before Thomas died. I unfolded the first page. Then I looked again. I honestly thought there had to be an extra zero. Estimated market value, $2,408 heat $6,000. I sat down so suddenly the old stool groaned beneath me. almost $2.5 million. Not from stocks, not from gambling, not from some secret inheritance. From 30 years of patience, 30 years of buying unwanted farmland before anyone else saw what it would become. The final envelope contained one more note, only one sentence. Money grows wherever patience survives longer than greed. That was Thomas, always teaching. Even after he was gone. 3 weeks later, Michael came by with coffee and a stack of papers. "I found a reputable auction company," he said. "They specialize in estate sales." I nodded. "They'll photograph everything." "Good. They expect a large turnout." "I'm sure they do." He hesitated. "Mom." "Yes?" "You've barely looked at the workshop." I looked toward the window. "I've looked at it every day." He misunderstood. "I mean emotionally." I smiled sadly. "I've been emotional every day." He sighed. "I just don't want you living inside memories forever." Neither did I. But there was something he couldn't possibly understand. Those tools were no longer just reminders of Thomas. They had quietly become a test my husband had designed years before anyone realized we would ever need one. And as the auction date drew closer, I began noticing something that troubled me far more than strangers buying old tools. Members of my own family had suddenly become very interested, not in remembering Thomas, but in calculating what everything might be worth. And that was exactly where my husband's real plan was about to begin. The auction was scheduled for a Saturday, 10 o'clock, clear skies, perfect weather. By 8:30, pickup trucks had already begun lining County Road 12, collectors, contractors, antique dealers, woodworkers from 3 different counties. Apparently, when an old craftsman's shop goes up for auction, word travels fast. I stood at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The workshop looked exactly as it always had, only today people weren't coming to build. They were coming to take it apart. Michael arrived just before 9. He kissed my cheek. "You don't have to stay if this is too hard." "I'll stay." "You sure?" "I need to." He nodded, relieved. "I think Dad would have wanted people using the tools." I looked at him for a long moment. "I hope you're right." He smiled. "I know I am." No, he didn't. The auctioneer introduced himself as Rick Collins, friendly, professional, the kind of man who could probably sell snow to people living in Alaska. He walked through the workshop making notes. "This place is incredible." "It was," I answered quietly. He looked around. "No, it still is." For some reason, that made me smile. By 10 o'clock, nearly 60 people filled the property. Some admired the old machines, others inspected hand tools. Several wandered through the workshop, taking photographs. I heard the same comments over and over. "Solid equipment. They don't make them like this anymore. Probably belonged to an old hobbyist. Most of it's outdated." That last one came from a young contractor who couldn't have been older than 30. Outdated. I almost laughed. The dining tables Thomas built 30 years ago were still standing in homes all across Vermont. I wondered how many of today's modern cabinets would survive even 10. Then my daughter-in-law arrived. Jennifer. Perfect hair, perfect shoes. Designer sunglasses that probably cost more than Thomas had spent on his first table saw. She hugged me politely. "I'm so sorry we're doing this so soon." Her words sounded kind. Her eyes were already scanning the workshop. "What do you think everything's worth?" she asked Michael. He shrugged. "I have no idea. I'm guessing at least 50,000. She wasn't whispering. I pretended not to hear. Instead, I watched Thomas's old apprentice, Ben Turner, 36 years old. He had worked beside my husband from the time he was 17 until he opened his own furniture business. Ben wasn't looking at prices. He was running his hand gently across the workbench, almost like greeting an old friend. After a few moments, he walked over to me. "Mrs. Bennett." "It's good to see you, Ben. I wish it were under different circumstances." "So do I." He glanced around the shop. "I still expect him to walk through that door carrying 2 cups of coffee." I smiled. He always forgot which one was his. Ben laughed softly. He did. For a few seconds, we simply stood there remembering. No talk about money, no talk about values, just Thomas, exactly the way he deserved to be remembered. That was the first thing I noticed. Some people remembered the man, others only noticed the merchandise. The bidding started with smaller items: clamps, hand saws, wood chisels, old measuring tools. People raised paddles almost mechanically. $20, $35, $50, $65. Everything moved quickly, too quickly. Each time another item disappeared into someone else's truck. The workshop looked a little emptier. It felt like watching pages being torn from a family photo album. Then something unexpected happened. Rick held up one of Thomas's oldest wooden mallets. The handle was worn smooth from decades of use. Most people ignored it. Ben raised his paddle. 20. Someone answered with 25. Ben immediately said 40. The other bidder stopped. Rick smiled. Sold. Ben carried the mallet over to me before placing it in his truck. I'm not buying tools, he said quietly. I'm buying memories. I swallowed hard. You already have those, he shook his head. Not enough. That sentence stayed with me because it reminded me of something Thomas had written. People always reveal themselves when they think they're dividing an inheritance. The auction had barely begun. Already, my husband had been proven right. And the hardest test of all hadn't even reached the bidding block yet. Around noon, the auction reached the larger pieces. The band saw, the drill press, Thomas's cabinet saw, machines he'd maintained so carefully that some were older than the people bidding on them. Rick's voice echoed through the workshop. Who'll give me 500? Hands went up. 600, 7, 8. The numbers climbed faster now. Jennifer quietly stepped beside Michael. I told you. He looked confused. Told me what? Your father had a fortune sitting out here. Michael smiled politely. It wasn't really about the money. Jennifer laughed. Everything's about the money eventually. I don't think she meant to be cruel. Some people simply grow up believing that every object has a price. Thomas believed every object had a story. Those are two very different ways of looking at the world. By 1 o'clock, nearly half the workshop was empty. Sunlight reached corners I'd never seen exposed before. The place echoed differently. It no longer sounded alive. It sounded abandoned. Rick wiped sweat from his forehead. Next item. He paused. The main workbench. Conversation stopped. Even people loading purchases turned around. Everyone knew this wasn't just another bench. It was the heart of the shop. 8 feet long, solid maple. Built entirely by Thomas himself 41 years earlier. Every cabinet, every rocking chair, every dining table, every cradle, every church restoration, every anniversary gift. Everything had begun on that bench. Rick smiled. We'll start at 300. Silence. Then Ben slowly raised his paddle. 300. Another bidder answered. 4. Ben nodded. 5. The bidding continued. 600. 700. 8. 9. 1,000. People stopped smiling. Nobody had expected an old workbench to bring this kind of money. Finally, only Ben and an antique dealer remained. 1,200. The dealer hesitated. Ben answered immediately. 15. The dealer shook his head. I'm out. Rick lifted his hammer. Sold. Applause broke out. Ben didn't celebrate. He walked directly toward the bench, placed one hand on its scarred surface, closed his eyes for just a second, then whispered something too quietly for anyone else to hear. I knew exactly what he'd said. Thank you. Thomas had taught him almost everything he knew. As the crowd spread out again, Jennifer leaned closer to Michael. I can't believe someone paid $1,500 for that. Michael shrugged. It meant something to him. She folded her arms. Still, if I'd known these old tools were worth this much, I'd have insisted we sold everything months ago. That sentence hit me harder than she realized, not because of the money, because of the word old. Old tools, old workshop, old furniture, old people. Some things become invisible simply because they've survived long enough. Rick looked down at his clipboard again. One final item remains. Everyone turned. The red toolbox, Thomas's toolbox, the same dented metal box he'd asked me to protect, the same one hiding the truth that nobody standing in that workshop could even imagine. Rick picked it up casually. It's got a nice vintage look. Who'll start me at $25? A few people chuckled. Compared to the expensive machinery, it looked almost worthless. Exactly as Thomas had predicted. One man offered 30, another said 40. Ben quietly raised his paddle. 50. The bidding slowed almost immediately. Jennifer whispered to Michael, "At least somebody wants the junk." I felt my stomach tighten. This was the moment. The promise. The promise. The reason Thomas had hidden everything. I watched every face in the room. Who saw an old toolbox? Who saw part of a man's life? Who saw only another object to flip for profit? Thomas had told me not to decide too early. Watch them first. So I watched. And then someone made an offer that changed everything, not because of the amount, but because of why they wanted the toolbox. "I'll give you 200. The voice came from the back of the crowd. Everyone turned. It wasn't Ben. It wasn't one of the antique dealers. It was a young man I had never seen before. He couldn't have been more than 28. Work boots, faded jeans, a sunburn across the bridge of his nose. He looked more like someone who spent his days building houses than collecting antiques. Rick smiled. "Well, that certainly wakes things up. Do I hear 250? Nobody answered. The young man kept his eyes on the toolbox. Not on the crowd, not on the auctioneer, just on the toolbox. Ben slowly lifted his paddle. 250. The young man answered immediately. 300. Now people were whispering. Jennifer leaned toward Michael. "Are they serious?" "I guess so." "It's a rusty toolbox." Michael didn't answer. Rick looked delighted. $300. Looking for 350. Ben hesitated, then nodded. 350. The young man smiled politely. 400. Ben finally lowered his paddle. "I'm out." Rick raised his hammer. 400. Going once. I couldn't stop staring at the stranger. There was no excitement on his face, no look of someone chasing a bargain. He looked hopeful, almost nervous, like buying that toolbox actually mattered. Rick lifted the hammer higher. Going twice. Before it could fall, I heard my own voice. "Excuse me." The entire workshop went silent. Rick lowered the hammer. "Mrs. Yusu, Bennett?" "I'd like to ask the gentleman a question." He nodded. "Of course." The young man stepped forward. "Ma'am?" I smiled gently. "May I ask why you want that toolbox?" Several people exchanged puzzled looks. Jennifer rolled her eyes. Michael looked embarrassed. The young man rubbed the back of his neck. "I suppose it sounds silly." "It won't." He glanced at the toolbox again. "My grandfather had one exactly like it." I said nothing. He continued. "He taught me carpentry. When he died, his voice caught slightly. His children sold all his tools before I could get there." The workshop became very quiet. "I've spent 5 years looking for one just like his. Not because it's valuable," he smiled. "Because when I see it, I remember being 10 years old, handing him nails that were usually the wrong size." A few people laughed softly. He laughed too. He'd pretend not to notice. I always thought I was helping. He shrugged. "I guess I'd just like one thing that reminds me of him." No one spoke. Even Jennifer looked down at the floor. The young man took a slow breath. "If someone else needs it more than I do, I understand. But that's why I'm bidding, nothing else. No speech, no performance, just the truth." I looked toward Ben. He smiled. Then, to my surprise, he set his bidding paddle on the table. "I'm officially out." Rick frowned. "You sure?" Ben nodded. "He deserves it." The young man turned toward him. "No, you've been bidding longer." Ben shook his head. I already have something your grandfather gave you. The young man looked confused. What? The memories. Ben smiled. I still have mine. You need yours back. For a moment, nobody moved. Then several people quietly applauded, not loudly, just enough to acknowledge what everyone had witnessed. It wasn't about the toolbox anymore. It was about the reason someone wanted it. And suddenly, I realized Thomas had been right again. The workshop had become exactly what he predicted, not an auction, a revelation. People weren't revealing how much money they had. They were revealing who they really were. I looked down at the toolbox, the hidden compartment, the letter, the deeds, nearly $2.5 million, still unknown to everyone standing there, including the young man. I could let the hammer fall, keep my promise, or I could finally tell the truth. The decision I made in the next 60 seconds would change far more than who went home with an old red toolbox. I'd like to withdraw that item. You could have heard a pin drop. Rick looked at me, confused. I'm sorry? The toolbox. I stepped forward. It isn't for sale. A ripple moved through the crowd. People glanced at one another. Someone muttered, "Can she do that?" Rick looked down at his clipboard, then back at me. "It is your estate, Mrs. Estate, Mrs. Near. Bennett. If that's your decision." He shrugged politely. "Oh, then that's your decision." He laid the hammer on the table. "The toolbox has been withdrawn. No one complained, not even the dealers. Most simply assumed sentiment had gotten the better of me. They thought I couldn't bear to part with my husband's favorite toolbox. That explanation was simple. The truth was far more complicated." The young man immediately stepped toward me. "I understand." His smile was disappointed, but genuine. "I'm sorry if I made things harder. You didn't. I'm really sorry. You have nothing to apologize for." He nodded respectfully. "I hope you keep it." Then he turned to leave. Something inside me stopped him. "Wait." He looked back. "What was your grandfather's name?" "Frank Sullivan." "What did he build?" "Houses, mostly barns. He taught anyone willing to learn." He smiled. "I think he believed carpentry was really just an excuse to spend time with people." I couldn't help smiling. "So did Thomas." The young man blinked. "You knew my grandfather?" "No, but I knew another man exactly like him." For a few seconds, we simply looked at each other. Two strangers connected by two craftsmen who had never met. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Ben stayed behind to help load the few remaining items. Michael was signing paperwork with the auction company. Jennifer was already calculating numbers. "I think today went better than expected." Michael nodded absently. "Probably. I told you the tools were worth money." He didn't answer. She continued anyway. "Between today's auction and selling the property," she stopped herself, "the workshop property, you'll probably be able to retire early." That sentence caught my attention. "The property?" Jennifer smiled. "It's a great location. I'm sure a developer would pay well." I watched Michael. He still hadn't spoken. Instead, he looked uncomfortable. Finally, he sighed. "Jennifer? What?" "We haven't talked about selling the land." She laughed. "We don't have to. It's obvious. The workshop's empty now. What else would we do with it?" I looked at my son. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the ground. Suddenly, I understood why Thomas had asked me to wait. This wasn't about greed, not entirely. It was something quieter, more dangerous. People begin making plans with money that isn't theirs, long before they actually have it. That evening, the workshop felt enormous. Half the shelves stood empty. The familiar sounds were gone. Only silence remained. I carried the red toolbox back onto Thomas's workbench. For a long time, I simply rested my hand on the lid. "You were right," I whispered. "Again?" I opened the hidden compartment. The envelope lay exactly where I'd left it. Beside it rested another folded sheet I'd somehow overlooked before. I frowned. I was certain it hadn't been there. Had I missed it? Carefully, I unfolded the page. Only 3 lines had been written. If you've waited this long, then you've already learned everything I hoped you would. Now it's time to tell them the truth." I stared at those words for nearly a minute. Thomas had anticipated this too. He knew I would hesitate. He knew I would watch. He knew I wouldn't reveal anything until I understood who everyone really was. And according to my husband, that moment had finally arrived. The next family dinner wasn't going to be about an auction. It wasn't even going to be about money. It was going to be about something far more uncomfortable, because everyone believed they already knew what Thomas had left behind. None of them had the slightest idea that the greatest inheritance had never been sitting on the workshop floor. It had been hidden in plain sight, inside the one rusty toolbox everyone thought was almost worthless. I invited everyone to dinner the following Sunday. Not because I wanted an apology. By then, I'd learned something Thomas had understood long before I did. Apologies offered after people discover the value of what they almost lost are rarely about regret. They're about damage control. I wasn't interested in either. I wanted the truth, the whole truth. And I wanted everyone to hear it at the same table. Michael arrived first. He looked exhausted. There were dark circles under his eyes that hadn't been there the week before. He hugged me longer than usual. "How have you been? I've been thinking." He managed a weak smile. "Dad always said that was dangerous." He wasn't wrong. For the first time all week, Michael laughed. It sounded good, real. Jennifer arrived 10 minutes later carrying a bottle of wine. "I hope this is okay. It looks lovely." She looked around the dining room. Everything was familiar. Thomas's old clock, the oak table he built on our 10th anniversary, the walnut sideboard he insisted was practice, even though people had offered thousands of dollars to buy it over the years. Jennifer had admired that sideboard dozens of times. She had never once asked who made it. Ben came carrying homemade bread. I figured Tom would have approved. He absolutely would. Then, to everyone's surprise, there was another knock at the door. I opened it. Standing there was the young man from the auction. He looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry. I know you didn't actually invite me." "You did." His eyebrows lifted. "I left an invitation with Rick. I asked him to give it to the gentleman who wanted the toolbox." He stared at me. "You remembered." I remembered why. "My name's Caleb, by the way." I smiled. "I'm glad you came." Dinner was quieter than usual. People spoke about ordinary things, the weather, construction, college football, anything except the auction. Everyone knew that wasn't why they were there. Even Jennifer. She kept glancing toward the hallway leading to the workshop, waiting. Finally, I stood. "I'll be right back." A minute later, I returned carrying the red toolbox. The room fell silent. I placed it gently in the center of the table. Nobody touched it. "I've been asked several times," I began quietly, "why I stopped the auction." No one answered. The truth is, I didn't stop it because this toolbox belonged to Thomas. I rested one hand on the worn metal lid. I stopped it because of what it taught me. Jennifer looked puzzled. Michael frowned. Caleb simply watched. I asked one question that afternoon. I looked toward Caleb. "Why do you want it?" He nodded slowly. "You answered without mentioning money." Then I looked toward Ben. "You stopped bidding because you believed someone else's memories mattered more than owning another tool." Ben looked down. "I just did what Tom would have done." "I know." Finally, I turned toward Michael, my son. He looked up. "You never asked me to sell the workshop because you wanted to hurt me." His shoulders relaxed slightly. "You wanted to make my life easier." "Yes." "I know." His eyes filled. "I'm sorry, Mom. I know you are." Then I looked at Jennifer. She shifted uneasily. "You saw numbers." She nodded almost imperceptibly. "I did. You weren't trying to be cruel. She stopped. "No, I wasn't. You simply believed value and price were the same thing." Her eyes dropped to the table. For the first time since I'd known her, she didn't defend herself. I slowly opened the toolbox, removed the upper tray, then the second. Michael leaned forward. I've never seen you do that. Neither had I. I pressed my thumb into the hidden groove. Click! The false bottom lifted. Every face around the table froze. Jennifer actually whispered, "What?" I removed the waterproof envelope, the deeds, the appraisal, Thomas's handwritten letter. No one spoke, not even Caleb. He had no idea why he was witnessing any of this. I laid the papers carefully across the table, one after another. Then I slid the appraisal toward Michael. He read the final page, stopped, read it again. His face turned pale. "Mom?" His voice barely existed. 2 million, I nodded. 2.486. Jennifer covered her mouth with both hands. Ben stared at the maps. Caleb looked completely lost. "What am I looking at?" I smiled gently. "The reason your grandfather's toolbox found its way back into this house." Then I unfolded Thomas's letter. "There are 2 things my husband wanted his family to hear. And I think," I looked around the table, "everyone here has finally earned the right to listen." I unfolded Thomas's letter as carefully as if it had been made of glass. The paper had yellowed slightly around the edges. I recognized every crease, every fold. I'd only read it once, the day I found it. After that, I placed it back inside the envelope exactly the way Thomas had left it. Some words deserve to wait. I looked around the table. "This isn't just for Michael," I said quietly. "It's for everyone sitting here." Then I began reading. "My family. If Margaret has decided you're hearing this, then she's already done the hardest part. She's watched, she's listened, and she's learned who each of you became after I was gone." I glanced at Michael. His eyes were already fixed on the table. "First, Michael. Son, if you're reading this, you're probably trying to fix everything. You've been doing that since you were 8 years old. When something broke, you always believed it was your job to repair it. Just remember, people aren't furniture. Not every problem needs to be solved immediately." Michael quietly wiped his eyes. That was Thomas. He could describe a person in 3 sentences better than most people managed in a lifetime. "Jennifer." She looked up, startled. "I didn't know. Neither had I. Thomas had written to everyone. You've always wanted the best for your family. There's nothing wrong with that. Just don't confuse expensive with important. The strongest table I ever built came from a tree nobody wanted. Remember that before you decide what or who is worth keeping." Jennifer stared at the paper. For once, there wasn't a single excuse ready, only silence. Thomas continued. "Ben." Ben laughed softly through his tears. "I should have known. You stopped being my apprentice years ago, long before I stopped calling you one. Thank you for caring more about the work than the paycheck. That's why I always trusted you with my best clients." Ben lowered his head. "I miss him every day." "So do I whispered. Then came something none of us expected. Thomas had written one final paragraph, not addressed to anyone by name, just, "To whoever opens this because they remember someone they loved." Caleb slowly looked up. Thomas had never known him, yet somehow the words felt written for him. "If you've ever reached for an old tool because it reminded you of someone who taught you kindness, then you're already richer than most people who'll ever live. Never let anyone convince you. Memories are clutter. They're the only inheritance that grows more valuable every year." Caleb looked away, blinking rapidly. "I wish he could have met my grandfather." I smiled. "I think they would have argued over whose coffee was worse." The room laughed. The tension broke, just enough. I folded the letter carefully. Then I slid the appraisal and property maps toward the center of the table. Thomas bought this land over 30 years, one parcel at a time. No loans, no gambling, no secret fortune, just patience. Michael shook his head slowly. "I had no idea." "I know. I handled his taxes. You handled the business. He handled the future." Michael buried his face in his hands. He stopped. "I honestly thought the workshop was everything." "It was," I smiled. But not because of the land. He looked confused. The workshop wasn't valuable because of what it contained. It was valuable because of the man who stood inside it. Jennifer finally spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I owe you an apology." I looked at her. She continued before I could answer. "No, I owe Thomas one." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I spent years seeing dollar signs. I never really saw him." Nobody interrupted. Some realizations deserve silence. They weren't just old tools. She looked toward the toolbox. They were his life. Then she turned to me. I'm ashamed of how I talked that day. For the first time, I believed her. Not because of the money, because she never mentioned it. I stood and carried the toolbox toward Caleb. He immediately shook his head. "I can't. You can." "No, ma'am. It belongs here. It belonged to Thomas." I smiled. "Thomas is gone. This," I rested both hands on the worn red metal, "is just a toolbox." Everyone looked at me, surprised. That's the lesson. The value was never inside the steel. It was inside the man who carried it. I gently placed it in Caleb's hands. I think he'd want it to belong to someone who still understands that. Caleb's voice cracked. "I don't know what to say. You don't have to." He looked down at the dented handle. "I'll use it. I know you will." "And every time I do," he swallowed, "I'll remember both of them." Thomas had been right one final time. The greatest inheritance isn't something you lock inside a hidden compartment. It's the character that survives after you're gone. And somehow, that turned out to be worth far more than $2.5 million. For a long time, no one said a word. The grandfather clock in the hallway seemed louder than it had ever been. Tick, tick, tick. Almost as if Thomas himself was patiently waiting to see what his family would do next. Finally, Michael pushed the appraisal papers away. "I don't want them." I looked at him. He met my eyes. He took a slow breath. "I don't want this to become the only thing we remember Dad for." He looked around the table. "I've spent the last week thinking about that auction. I kept replaying it in my head. I told myself I was helping you. Maybe part of me was. But another part," he swallowed hard. He swallowed hard, had already started imagining what selling everything would solve. No one interrupted. I wasn't thinking about Dad. I was thinking about numbers, and I hate admitting that. I reached across the table and took his hand. Recognizing it is how you stop becoming that person. Ben unfolded one of the property maps again. "So," he asked quietly, "what happens now?" Everyone looked at me. It was the question Thomas had left for me alone, not because he wanted to control the answer, because he trusted me to choose it. I smiled. "Nothing." Jennifer frowned. "Nothing? The land isn't being sold." She blinked. "But—" I shook my head. "I've already made up my mind. I spent 45 years watching Thomas build things. I refuse to spend the rest of my life tearing them down." Michael slowly nodded. "I think Dad would have liked that. I know he would." I reached into the envelope one last time. There was one final document. I didn't show anyone because I wanted you to hear everything else first. Michael looked surprised. "There's more?" "There always was." I unfolded a notarized sheet. Thomas's signature sat at the bottom. So did the signature of an attorney. "This land," I said, "was never meant to become anyone's personal inheritance." Jennifer looked stunned. "What do you mean? It already belongs to a trust." Ben raised his eyebrows. "A trust?" I nodded. "Thomas created it 6 years before he died." The room fell silent again. "The land can never be divided. It can never be sold for private profit. It can never become anyone's vacation home or investment." Michael whispered. He already decided, yes. I looked at each person around the table. He called it the Bennett Workshop Foundation. Ben covered his mouth. "Oh, Tom, the income from the land will fund apprenticeships for young people who want to learn woodworking, cabinet making, furniture restoration, and other traditional trades." Caleb stared at me. You mean students who can't afford training, veterans starting over, teenagers who need a second chance, anyone willing to learn how to build instead of destroy. Ben laughed through his tears. That sounds exactly like him. It does. Michael looked at the papers for a long time. Finally, he smiled. You know something? What? This is better than inheriting the money. Jennifer looked at him. He continued. If Dad had simply left us millions, we probably would have argued. We would have hired lawyers. We would have found reasons why each of us deserved a bigger share. He laughed sadly. He knew us too well. Everyone smiled. He didn't leave us money. He left us responsibility. A month later, the workshop was full again. Not of customers, not of buyers, of students. Ben volunteered to teach every Saturday. Retired craftsmen from neighboring towns offered to help. A local high school partnered with the foundation. Soon there were teenagers learning how to sharpen chisels, how to build dovetail joints, how to repair furniture instead of throwing it away. Every lesson began with the same sentence hanging above Thomas's old workbench. Anything worth building is worth repairing. It wasn't just about wood anymore. It never had been. Caleb still carries the red toolbox. Every few months he stops by to help with a class. The paint is even more scratched now. The handle has another crack. He refuses to restore it. It already tells the perfect story, he says. I think Thomas would approve. As for Michael, he visits every Wednesday evening after work, not because he has to, because he wants to. Sometimes he teaches young apprentices the business side of running a workshop. Sometimes he simply sweeps the floor. He says it helps him think. Jennifer surprised all of us. She became the foundation's accountant. She still loves spreadsheets, but now they're helping young people build careers instead of calculating what someone else left behind. People change. Sometimes they just need the chance. This story stayed with me for weeks after Margaret sent it. Not because of the hidden compartment, not because of the land, and not because of the money. The moment I couldn't stop thinking about was when Caleb explained why he wanted that old red toolbox. He didn't see an object. He saw a memory. I think that's where many families quietly lose each other. They spend so much time asking, what's it worth, that they forget to ask, what did it mean? By the time they remember, the answer has often already been sold. Thomas understood something remarkable. A real legacy isn't measured by what people receive after you're gone. It's measured by the kind of people they choose to become because you were here. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done in Margaret's place? And have you ever owned something that looked ordinary to everyone else, but meant the world to you because of the person behind it? Thank you for spending this time with me. Until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of each other.